Janet Pedrazi, the Director of Academic Content here at Lexplore, and I'm excited to highlight this information-packed webinar that will support teachers and teacher leaders in understanding the science of reading. You will learn how evidence-based reading instructional practices can conquer those reading achievement gaps and also prevent reading difficulties. Elise Spang, an expert in the science of reading, will walk us through the steps of how brain research and instructional practice research work together. This combination guides good teaching by providing a framework to create learning experiences needed to build these brain pathways that are necessary for becoming proficient readers. Now, building these brain pathways is not as tricky as it sounds. The Lexplore reading assessment helps to identify these readers that might be falling through the cracks and are in need of that science-based skill instruction. Lexplore also provides next steps based on the science of reading to help address these needs and the needs of all readers. This webinar also illustrates how some very common reading instructional practices actually perpetuate reading difficulties and hinder the development of these essential brain pathways needed for becoming proficient readers. We are thrilled to present this webinar and provide educators with the tools needed to conquer the reading achievement gaps and support evidence-based reading instruction for all readers.
Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Conquering the COVID Slide, using the science of reading to quickly close the achievement gap. We want to just take a quick moment to thank all of our educators and parents for helping move learning forward with our students during this challenging time. And we are honored today to have Elise Spang, an educator, college professor, and science of reading expert, join us today and share this information on quickly closing the achievement gap. So with that, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Elise.
Good morning, everyone, or maybe good afternoon, depending where you are. My name is Elise Spang, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. So we have actually a lot of content to cover, so I'm going to just jump right in. I want you to take a look at this class of 24 kindergartners. Here they are on their first day of school, and look at their bright, shining, happy faces. They are so excited to be at school. They're so excited to learn new things. And one of the things they're most excited to learn is how to read, right? So in a class of 24 kindergartners, we know that some kids may come to school already reading. Some will likely learn to read no matter what instructional approach we use. Some are going to require systematic explicit instruction. Some will require that plus additional interventions. And some may have a true reading disability that requires special education services. So I want you to think about it for a moment. And in a class of 24 kindergartners, how many would you put in each of these categories? I'm going to give you a few moments to think about it. You can just jot your answers down on a piece of paper next to you, or just think of them and then check them against the answers in a sec. Okay, so in a normal distribution of 24 kids, how many will come to school already reading? Just one. That might surprise you. How many will learn to read no matter what approach we use? About 7 or 30% or so. How many are going to require that systematic explicit core instruction? 8. About 35% of kids really need that systematic core instruction. Another 7 will need that plus additional interventions. And maybe 1 out of the 24, about 5% of kids have a true reading disability that requires special education services. So as you reflect on this, the big takeaway here is that instruction matters, right? The majority of kids need instruction to be very explicit and systematic. It's good for all, but required and necessary for most. So that's kind of a big takeaway of today's session. So what's going to happen to these 24 kids by grade 4? Only about 35% of them are going to read at proficiency in grade 4 measures. So, you know, of course we want all of these kids to become fluent and proficient readers, but unfortunately in our country, that's just not a reality. That means about 2/3 of them, or 16 out of these 24 kids, are going to fall through the cracks and experience reading difficulties. So how do we know this? Well, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or our nation's report card, about 2/3 of America's 4th and 8th graders are reading below grade level. So we know what the science says, we know what we need to do to fix this problem, but unfortunately, we haven't taken the steps necessary to do that. And it's just not acceptable in a country like America that 2/3 of our kids are not reading at proficiency, right? But is this a 4th grade issue? Is this something that we can deal with once kids hit 4th grade and utilize interventions and remediation programs to help fix the problem? Well, that depends on the answer to this question, right? How successful are intervention programs? What does the research show about the effectiveness of them? Sadly, despite the enormous resources devoted to intervention and remediation, the research all says that while some remedial programs show some initial success, the effects tend to dissipate over time. So it's just too little, too late for many, many children. We also know that when kids fall behind in these early grades, it's really, really difficult to catch them up. Reading trajectories show that as kids fall behind, you can see here on the graph that the gap tends to widen between struggling readers and successful readers. And the amount of time and resources required to catch students up just grows over time. And so sometimes that bridge is just too great to ameliorate. We also know that about 10 million children will encounter reading problems in those crucial first 3 years of school. And all this despite the millions and billions of dollars that illiteracy costs our country and the remediation programs that we spend money on each year. Now, this has all been a problem even before COVID-19 hit, right? But the impacts of COVID-19 and learning loss on reading is going to be great. We have every reason to believe that the instructional needs in reading are going to be even more so when we come back to school. And because kids are missing that critical face-to-face reading instruction and that time has been lost, the students with reading difficulties, right, those students that are most at risk and most in need will be the most severely impacted by this learning loss. This is from an article just written by Dr. Emily Solari at the University of Virginia. This was just written a couple of weeks ago. And I encourage you to Google this article. It's from the 74million.org. Google her name and you can find that article there. There's also a link on the screen here. But I don't mean to be all doom and gloom because there really is good news, right? We can do something about reading failure. We don't have to wait for remediation and intervention. With research and evidence-based instruction and focused intervention, we can reduce the incidence of failure to 5% or less in those crucial first few years of school. So how do we do this? Well, we have to educate ourselves about the science of reading and utilize what it teaches us. So what is the science of reading? The science of reading is not a particular philosophy or a political agenda, right? It includes all the methods or approaches that have been found through research, through evidence, to give kids an advantage in reading, right? Again, just to point out, it's not a political agenda, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, it's not a particular program or a specific component of instruction. It's just an emerging consensus from researchers in multiple disciplines. It's supported by research dollars and conducted across the world in many languages. So the science of reading, again, is not something that we have to fear or think is someone's agenda. It's something that we can all agree on because it's a consensus of research. So what are the key factors of effective instruction that adheres to this in science of reading? Well, effective instruction has to be early and intentional. It has to be based on research and evidence. It has to be explicit, systematic, and cumulative. We have to give kids a chance to apply what they're learning to real complex text. And it has to be engaging and motivating. So let's start with this concept of early and intentional, right? We saw earlier what happens to kids when they fall behind in first grade. They rarely catch up. But why? Well, it's because they fall into this cycle, right? Why do kids fall further and further behind? Well, when they experience difficulty in the early grades, maybe they have difficulty blending those sounds together and sounding out words. That leads to difficulty in decoding words and phrases and sentences, which leads to lack of fluency. And when kids aren't fluent readers and reading is laborious and difficult, they tend to avoid it, right? Because kids don't want to do things that are hard for them and where they feel unsuccessful. so they get less and less reading practice. And because they're not reading as widely and as deeply, they don't have that vocabulary growth. They have limited academic language and content knowledge. And so because of all of those factors, they don't have great reading comprehension, right? And when you don't understand what you're reading, reading becomes a pretty pointless task. So there's not a lot of motivation to keep going, right? And then because they're not motivated and because they're avoiding because they're avoiding reading, they still continue to have difficulty in blending and decoding. They continue to have difficulty with fluency and vocabulary and academic knowledge. And so we call this the self-perpetuating cycle of reading difficulties. And so it's really important because we don't want to wait to intervene after kids start to struggle, because that cycle of difficulties has then already begun. Prevention of reading difficulties is always preferable to intervention later on. It doesn't mean that we don't intervene later if we need to, but if we can avoid that cycle and prevent reading difficulties before they start, has a much better outcome. In addition, instruction must be based on research and evidence. And so we've got two sources of information that let us know what research-based instruction is, right? We've got neuroscientists who study what the brain does when engaged in the reading process, and we have educational researchers who study what happens in the classroom. So let's take a look at the neuroscience first. What do we know about how the brain learns to read? Well, we have 2 decades of research to help us figure this out, right? We know that the brain isn't hardwired for reading. Unlike language, we don't have all the neural connections in place to become readers, right? Those neural connections for reading have to be formed. And for the great majority of us, that happens through instructional experiences. So how do we know which neural connections to build? Well, we have what's called fMRI technology. So you've heard of MRIs. They study the structure of the brain. fMRIs study brain function, right? And so fMRIs can shed some light as researchers have been able to study what parts of the brain are activated when a subject is engaged in the reading process. And the way this works is that the fMRI measures the blood supply to different parts of the brain. When students are engaged in a task like reading, more neurons are firing to certain parts of the brain. And so more oxygenated blood flows to those areas. And then the iron in the blood produces a stronger magnetic signal that can be picked up by the machine. And what researchers have found is that these are the parts of the brain that are activated when a fluent reader is engaged in a reading task. So first of all, this is all taking place in the left hemisphere. And so we have in the back of the brain here, this blue area is called the orthographic processor. And this is the part of the brain that processes symbols like letters and words. We also have in the front of the brain, the phonological processor. This is the part of the brain that processes sounds. So we're born with these 2 areas intact. However, this third area is called the sound symbol connection area. And this is something we have to build. We call this the neural superhighway. And that superhighway travels from the letters in the orthographic processor to the sounds in the phonological processor, and then back again from the sounds to the letters. And it really has to flow in both directions. So as students learn to connect letters and sounds to letters, they build this neural superhighway. And the more practice they get, the stronger these neural connections become. In fact, as Dr. Sally Shaywitz states, within the brain, the child is building that neural circuitry that links the sounds or the phonemes to the print code or the letters that represent these sounds. So on this slide, we can see actual fMRI scans of a fluent reader and those of a pre-reader. And as you can see from these 2 scans, fluent readers have amassed a strong network of neural connections between the phonological processor, where the sounds are stored, and the orthographic processor, where the letters are stored. But the beginning reader has not yet done so, right? So now let's compare a fluent reader to the struggling reader, right? See the left hemisphere here. You can see that the fluent reader has that strong connection, has those strong connections, but the struggling reader doesn't have those yet, right? There are not as many neural connections, and generally the neural connections that are present are much less activated. Let's look at the right hemisphere of a struggling reader's brain. So what do you notice here? The right hemisphere is a lot more active, right? Instead of connecting the sounds and symbols in the left hemisphere and building that neural highway between the two, children with reading difficulties often build an alternate neural pathway in the right hemisphere. So this may sound like a great solution, right? These kids are compensating by building this alternate neural pathway, but unfortunately, the right hemisphere is not an area well suited to reading. And researchers call this reading on the wrong side of the brain. So let's take a look at what reading on the wrong side of the brain looks like. So this is a very typical kindergarten leveled reader, right? I used to use these in my classroom years ago, right? Some children very early on would be given this book and be asked to read it, right? So the child is saying the words on the page. Maybe I would introduce the first page and say, I take pencils, right? And I would point out the words I and take, and then show the picture and how the picture gives a clue about what that final word says. And then the child would read, I take markers, I take paper, I take scissors. And the child is reading the words and turning the pages, and she looks like a reader, and she sounds like a reader, and she's acting like a reader. But what is she actually doing here, right? Is she really reading? Is she unlocking the words and making those connections in the left hemisphere to connect the letters and the sounds? Does she know the vowel consonant E pattern in take, or the R controlled in scissors, or the soft C in scissors, right? Does she know those patterns? Probably not, because if there are any kindergarten teachers here on the call, you know that we don't teach those complex phonetic patterns as early in kindergartens. In fact, some of those don't even occur until later in first grade or even second grade. So what is she actually doing here? What are we actually asking her to do? Well, we're asking her to memorize a pattern, right? Not a phonetic pattern, but a text pattern. We're asking her to look at the picture, and we're asking her to basically guess what the word says. And so as my colleague or Stuart from the Reading League calls this, she calls it freeding or fake reading, right? And when we move children through text that encourages memorization and guessing, we're keeping them reading in that right hemisphere where we store visual images. And she's not utilizing that neural network in the left hemisphere that connects sounds and symbols, right? And this is a problem because I always think of the left hemisphere like a muscle. And so going to the gym, right? We have to go to the gym, we have to work that muscle to make it stronger. It's the same thing with these connections in the left hemisphere. It takes a lot of practice and instruction to build a strong, robust neural connection. And if kids are practicing in the right hemisphere, they're not having the opportunity to build those neural connections in the left. Dr. Sally Shaywitz reminds us that 2/3 of poor readers actually have the neurological systems intact, right? They have no neurological deficits that are preventing them from learning to read. They just haven't had the right kind of instruction that allows for the development of those connections within the left hemisphere. She calls this environmentally influenced dyslexia because the instructional environment is a contributing factor to their struggles in learning to read. But she also goes on to say that if we can give kids the right kind of instruction early on, they really can learn to read. So we talked about the neuroscience. Let's take a look at the educational research. We know from all the educational research that's been conducted in classrooms that instruction in reading must be explicit, systematic, and cumulative. We've got 3 decades of research, thousands of studies, millions of children studied, thousands of articles and books written, and they all say the same thing. Explicit, systematic phonics instruction is critical for learning to read. This is likely not news to you. You've probably heard that before, right? So let's think about it this way, because phonics can be really powerful. If a child memorizes 10 words, that child can read 10 words. But if we teach a child the sounds of 10 letters, that child can actually read thousands of words, right? And that makes sense. And this always reminds me of the proverb, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but if you teach him to fish, you can feed him for a lifetime. It's similar, and that's really the power of phonics. So people always say, you talk a lot about phonics, what about reading comprehension? And of course, reading comprehension is important. In fact, it's the end goal of learning to read. There is no point in reading if you're not reading with comprehension. But I want you to ponder this question for a second. What percentage of kids with reading comprehension difficulties also have problems with decoding and or oral language comprehension? Oral language comprehension is kind of like vocabulary issues. So what percent of kids that have reading comprehension difficulties also have problems with decoding and or vocabulary? Is it 30%, 50%, or 99%? Well, you might be surprised to know that it's actually over 99% of kids. And so poor reading comprehension is associated with inadequate decoding or inadequate vocabulary more than 99% of the time. Strong comprehension can't occur until students have strong decoding skills and strong oral language comprehension skills, right? We need that strong foundational base. And this makes sense if you think about reading according to the simple view of reading model, right? Why is reading comprehension so tied to decoding and oral language? Well, this model might shed some light. This is Guff and Tumner's simple view of reading model, and it states that reading is essentially a product of decoding or word recognition, which is getting that text off the page, sounding out the words, and language comprehension. And this seems pretty simple, but it's interesting to note that reading is not a sum, right? It's not decoding plus comprehension. It's the product of these two skills and capabilities. So let's think of it as an example. Using a factor of 1 for evidence of a skill and 0 for no evidence of all, let's say a child is just unable to decode words, but that child has really strong verbal and background knowledge skills. So for that child, the D would be 0, LC would be 1, 0 times 1 is still 0. So the reading comprehension is negatively impacted by the lack of decoding skills. Let's flip it. Let's say the child has great decoding skills, but lacks that vocabulary and background knowledge. Then we'd have 1 times 0 is still 0, right? In fact, if either decoding or language comprehension is impaired in any way, it's going to negatively impact the reading comprehension piece. So sometimes thinking about it as a math equation helps shed some light on how it all works. So as a beginning reader is developing, most of that brain energy is really devoted to the decoding part of the simple view, right? How many times have you worked with a student who's struggling to decode each word in a sentence, and by the time she gets to the end of that sentence, she's forgotten the content of what she's read, right? That's because all of her brain energy or her working memory is focused on getting that text off the page, right? She doesn't have a lot of cognitive energy left to focus on the meaning. But as the reader develops and decoding becomes more fluent and automatic, it requires less brain energy, which can then be devoted to the meaning of the words in the text. But beginning readers have to go through this stage, right? They have to build the decoding habit and become fluent decoders in order to get to this place. So early on, we have to concentrate our instructional attention to building those skills. As the child becomes more fluent, the instructional focus can shift to making meaning. Let's think of it this way. It's sort of this predictable progression of skill development, right? We have to focus on a research-proven sequence of instruction. And so we can build those word recognition skills, which include phonemic awareness, which is the ability to recognize and manipulate the individual sounds of language, right? We also need to have letter recognition, naming, and letter formation skills. We also have to have the ability now to connect those letters and sounds together. That's the phonics instruction. The phonics instruction is the alphabetic principle where we're connecting the letters of to the sounds and the sounds back to the letters, and all the while building those connections in the left brain. We also have to start blending those sounds together to read words, blending and segmenting, which eventually leads to decoding, sounding out the words, and encoding, which is spelling the words. And sometimes kids have to learn what we call memory words. These are words that are not phonetically regular. They don't follow the rules per se, and so they need to be taught just to be memorized, words like the and of. Now, all the while we're building these word recognition skills, we're not ignoring the other piece of the simple view, which is language comprehension. Even before kids become fluent readers and decoders, right, we can work on these language comprehension skills like oral language, vocabulary, and listening comprehension. And we can do that through read alouds, oral language activities, and through building knowledge in the content areas. Now, as the reader develops, those word recognition skills become more automatic, and those language comprehension skills become more strategic until the child is reading fluently at an appropriate pace with prosody and expression. And once the child has built all of those skills, he's primed for text comprehension, which is of course that end goal of reading. So how do we build those word recognition skills to automaticity? Well, we need a system that teaches the phonics skills explicitly and has a sensible scope and sequence that moves from the simple to the more complex and has lots and lots of cumulative review built in. And you can see an example here from the Super Kids program. And that brings me to my next point. Here we are teaching all these phonics skills, and many people do. But I think what's lacking in a lot of classrooms is that teaching all of these skills is wonderful, but if we don't give kids a chance to apply those skills with real, engaging, complex text, then what's the point, right? We have to give them a chance to actually use those skills. So I'm going to turn back here, another example of a typical kindergarten text. And as I read through it, I want you to think about what phonic elements students would have to know to decode these words. This is, again, a typical kindergarten text. So I like to find things. I like to find beetles. And notice the picture of the beetle in the top right corner. I like to find tadpoles. I like to find spiders. So if we're thinking about the phonics skills that kindergartners would need to know to decode these words, right? We see VCE patterns, we see open syllables, we see R-controlled, we see vowel teams, consonant LE, that IND pattern. Do we teach kindergartners those patterns? I know from my kindergarten and first grade teachers on the call, you are probably saying, no way, we don't teach those. They're way too complex for kindergartners. So what are we asking kids to do here? Do these look familiar to you? I know I used them in my own classroom years ago. And so here are some typical strategies that many teachers use, right? I've seen them in classrooms all over the country. But based on what you've been learning about the reading brain, what's problematic about these? What's problematic about using the picture to guess the word, or trying to reread the sentence and think about what makes sense, or skipping over the word and coming back to it, or just looking at that first letter? What's problematic about these? Well, if we think about it, there's really no research base for these strategies. Nothing in the decades of research that I mentioned earlier supports them as effective for learning to read. Also, they diminish the role of that letter-sound relationship, right? It doesn't actually acknowledge that there's any sort of phonology involved. If letters and sounds are mentioned at all, it's just to simply look at that first letter and guess the rest. And as you might have guessed, these strategies direct the reader to use right brain thinking, right? Like looking at the picture, memorizing the pattern. In addition, these strategies are not sustainable, right? What happens when that pattern text and those picture clues go away? Students just have no strategies to read an unknown word. And then finally, and to me, this is the most important, if we don't give kids a chance to connect letters and sounds to connected text, we're just losing an opportunity to build that reading brain in the left hemisphere, right? We're losing the opportunity to connect the letters and the sounds. And remember that we have to work to build that neural superhighway, right? Decoding words in a text is a great opportunity for practice, but the strategies that we just looked at earlier don't encourage that kind of practice. So instead, we really need to teach kids decoding strategies, right? They have to look carefully at the word and the whole word, not just the first letter. They have to think about all the sounds and blend them in order. Instead of asking, does it look right? We have to ask, does it sound right? Based on the letters you see, did you pronounce the word right? And then of course, fix pronunciations as needed. And it's not that we ignore the pictures. We can use the pictures to confirm meaning, but just not for word recognition. And so in order to build these decoding skills, we need daily and repeated practice in decoding, both in words in isolation and words in context. And I'm going to specify here that we need to utilize decodable text, especially in kindergarten and first grade, right? The type of text that we use really matters, right? The type of text that we give them will determine the strategies they use. When we give kids text that includes letters and sounds that they haven't learned, like the text we saw earlier, I like to find things, we're encouraging them to use those unsustainable right brain strategies and setting them up to struggle. When we use decodable text, right, We're asking them to apply the only reliable and sustainable strategy, which is decoding. And we're giving them more opportunities to build that circuitry in that left hemisphere, which is, of course, so important, right? So when we give them decodable text, we're setting them up for success because they have the ability to use their first and best strategy, which is decoding. But what makes decodable text decodable? Well, you probably guessed that in decodable text, most of the words have phonetically regular relationships, right? They follow the rules of the English language. But in addition, there has to be a match between the words in the text and what's been taught in the classroom, right? Like the vowel consonant E pattern is a phonetically regular relationship, but if I haven't yet learned that pattern, it's not decodable to me, right? So the words and the sentences introduced in the text should really only include the letters and sounds that have been taught. And we call this the lesson to text match. And it's really pivotal to the successful use of decodable text. But as we know, unfortunately, decodable text often looks like this, right? They're usually dull and boring, and they drain focus and motivation. And so one of the things we have to ensure is that even decodable texts have to be worth reading. They have to be complex and engaging, right? So I'm going to show you some examples from the Super Kids program here. This first text that we're going to look at is from about 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks into the school year. The kids have taken a deep dive into these 6 letters and sounds. You can see there's a combination of consonants and vowels, and it's just the hard consonants and the short vowels here. And you can see our Super Kid Sal. He's our sporty super kid, and he loves sports. So here he is at the punching bag, sock, sock, sock. And then there's a hole, and the bag deflates. It sags, and he feels sad. So he brings it to his super kid buddy, Doc, who's our fix-it girl, and she takes it to the gas station and pumps it up with air, and he's back at it again, sock, sock, sock. So this is a simple story. You know, it has a beginning, middle, and end, and a problem and solution. It has characters and a setting, and even some vocabulary words with sock and sag. But most importantly, it allows students to use their newly learned decoding skills to truly sound out every single word on the page, right? We've set them up for success because we've given them all the skills and strategies they need to tackle every single word on the page. I want to point out too that all of these letters all start at that 2 o'clock position and circle back for that letter formation piece, which is so essential. Research tells us it's also very important for learning those letters and sounds. So that's a beginning of kindergarten text in a decodable text format. Let's look at what middle of kindergarten could look like. By the time kids reach middle of kindergarten in the Super Kids program, they know these 6 letters and they've learned 7 more. And again, deep dive and mastery into these 13 letters and sounds. And now they can read a book like Gulls. They've also learned the memory word the here. And so they can sound out and decode every single word on the page. The gull adds fluff and the gull has eggs. They can use the pictures to confirm what they read, but they can't use the pictures to guess at the words, right? In addition, there's some higher order thinking skills you can do with this text. What do we know about birds? What's our background knowledge tell us about birds, and what do we see on the page? The gull is adding fluff. What do you think the gull might be doing here? Right? Let's make an inference. Okay, the gull's building a nest. Why is the gull building a nest? Oh, because she has eggs. What do you think she might do next? Well, here she is sitting still. So what do you think she's doing? Let's make an inference. The text doesn't tell us, but we can use our background knowledge and we can use what the text says to make an inference. These are higher order thinking skills, right? Not to mention the vocabulary, the gull's fuss. What does fuss mean? Fuss means maybe to cry and to whine. Do any of you out there have a baby brother or sister who might fuss? Why might they fuss? Maybe they're hungry. Do you think these baby birds could be hungry? What do you think might happen next? Maybe the mommy's going to feed them. So again, some higher order thinking skills here, but even more importantly, all the words are decodable for the kids, right? So they can really sound out every word on the page. So again, that's middle of kindergarten. By the end of kindergarten, they've learned all 26 letters and sounds, short vowels and hard consonants, and they can read a book like Gifts. Notice here, multisyllabic words, words with blends, right? But they can truly read and sound out every word on the page, except for those words that have been taught to them as memory words. By the middle of first grade, they've learned more advanced phonetic patterns. And we have our differentiated library where they can read an easy book like this. This would be from our easy library. This would be from our on level library. And then this would be from our challenging library. And the main differences here is that they're all cumulatively decodable. They've learned all the letters and sounds they need to read the text. But in the more challenging library, there's more multisyllabic words, more text on the page. This is also from our nonfiction grade 1 magazine, Super Duper. Now, by the time they hit second grade, they've learned enough phonetic patterns and they've mastered them so that we can actually remove those decodable controls and they can read authentic text, like our second grade nonfiction magazine, Super. And they can also take part in our book club series of trade books or novels, like Tornado. So we call this building that staircase of complexity, right? It's based on a very careful and intentional progression of text that moves from the cumulatively decodable to the non-decodable by the time they hit second. It gives them in KN1 an opportunity to practice those newly learned decoding skills, right? To actually apply what they're learning to real and engaging text. And it supports them as they move from that decodable text in KN1 to the non-decodable text in second grade. Now, all along the way, while we're using decodable text, I want to point out that I think you'll agree that the texts are still worth reading. It's not that fat cat sat on the mat, right? It's got to be engaging and worth reading, which really leads me to my next point, which is that instruction has to be engaging and motivating, right? So what makes motivation occur, right? Motivation is obviously extremely important to students' learning. I don't have time today to discuss all the research behind motivation, but it makes sense. It's common sense, right? When kids are motivated, they're better learners. So what's the magic equation that builds motivation? Well, first of all, we have to give students instruction and materials that are interesting to them, right? We can't give them the fat cat sat on the mat, right? Because it has to be interesting. Otherwise, they're not motivated to read. Secondly, we have to give material that's relevant to them and their lives. So for example, in our Super Kids program, they spend the first half of the kindergarten year meeting these 14 Super Kids characters. These characters kind of go through typical things that all kids go through. Their experiences are universal to all children. So as children are reading about these characters, they relate to it, right? They connect with it. And so they meet these characters in kindergarten, they follow them onto first and then second grade, and they grow alongside them and experience the world in new ways as they get older. And so they're having so much fun kind of reading about their friends that they almost forget they're doing that hard work of learning to read. So again, material that's relevant to them and to their lives is really important too. And then finally, we have to make sure that students experience success, because when kids experience failure, it's not very motivating, right? We talked about that self-perpetuating cycle of reading failure earlier. So if you give them the skills they need to be successful and give them lots of opportunities to apply those skills, they will become accurate and fluent decoders, and their brain energy can really be freed up to focus on that meaning, and then they'll experience that success. And when you put all of these three things together, you avoid that self-perpetuating cycle of reading failure, and you've got motivated kids. So just to sum up, here are the characteristics of effective instruction. And I want to leave you with a few ideas today. I hear all the time, well, there's not just one way to learn to read. Every kid's different, and there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And while I agree there's no one-size-fits-all approach, it's actually not true that there's lots of different ways to learn to read. We all have basically the same brain and have to go through the same learning sequence. And while cultural, economic, socioeconomic, educational circumstances can affect progress either negatively or positively, what we need to learn doesn't change, right? We all have to learn the same skills in order to become readers. And we also know that literacy can really be a reality for almost all, right? All but the most severe reading disabilities can be ameliorated in the early grades with the right kind of instruction. So the takeaways for today's session are, we do have a national reading crisis, and that crisis is going to be exacerbated by COVID-19. We cannot avoid that. But there's good news, because we know what the evidence says about what works in reading instruction. We know that the large majority of kids can become proficient readers if we give them that instruction. And then finally, due to the COVID slide, we cannot waste any more time using ineffective instructional strategies that aren't backed up by research and evidence. This is the time we can deliver on the promise of reading for all. And now more than ever, it's more important, right? So basically, we don't have to lose 2/3 of our kids to reading failure. It doesn't have to be this way. All kids can be successful. They can be successful and proficient readers. It can be this way. So that is the end of my presentation. And I know we have a little bit of time for some questions and answers.
So we had a couple of great questions. One from a school leader: how can school leadership help teachers let go of predictable text and the 3 cueing strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about professional development and education. Unfortunately, we know that a lot of the reading programs, the graduate programs that educate teachers don't necessarily teach the science of reading. Some do, and it is growing day by day, and there's more kind of interest and excitement about the topic. But for years, many people were in teacher prep programs that didn't talk about this. So it's really hard for teachers to kind of change their mindsets. And I mean, I taught using predictable text too. So it's all about education and professional development. I mean, it starts with strong leadership. I would say that it's all about understanding and not blaming. You know, I worry sometimes when I'm showing those strategies like Eagle Eye and all that, that teachers are going to feel blamed or, you know, like someone's accusing them of doing the wrong thing. And I think I really want to make it clear that I know teachers always have the best intentions, you know, but it's all about educating ourselves. When we know better, we do better. That's something that my colleague Laura Stewart says. And, you know, I just think it's all about education and professional development, really.
Yeah. Great answer. Then Samuel asked about assessments. Based on what I know, the oral reading fluency seems to be the most efficient and effective reading screener as an initial start before determining either phoneme or phonic deficiencies. However, the oral reading fluency doesn't measure any comprehension issues. This seems to be the main concern from teachers about moving away from Fontes and Pinnell assessments to oral reading fluency. How does one respond to this concern?
So, you know, I think when we talked about sort of that simple view, right? If kids have oral reading fluency issues, it doesn't matter how great their language comprehension skills are, because their reading comprehension will still be at 0 if they can't decode. And so it's just a shift in instruction. And it doesn't mean that we ignore those language comprehension issues. We teach those. We can do it through read alouds, through content knowledge, right? We can still teach those language comprehension issues. And when it all comes together, it comes together in reading comprehension. I just want to point out one thing that question mentioned, which is oral reading fluency can point out phoneme issues. It can, but you also want to do measures of, you know, phonemic awareness, like measures that aren't print related, to make sure that your students have good phonemic awareness. So those would be like oral blending and segmenting and things like that too. I hope that kind of answered the question, but I think the simple view of reading is a really powerful tool and message for teachers that if kids have issues with reading comprehension, it's likely related to decoding and or language comprehension. And we can teach both of those in an explicit systematic program that teaches phonics and teaches those oral language comprehension skills.
Great. How can children who are already failing in middle school be motivated to read? Tough question.
Yeah, that's a really tough question. You know, it's all about assessment. So we have to see where the breakdown is happening. You know, I call this diagnostic teaching. We have to go back and assess and see what actually is the cause of the issue, the root cause, and remediate that. You know, a lot of times we're hesitant to bring kids in middle school back to that phonics piece, but it may be necessary. And so it's all about the right assessments and figuring out where that breakdown is occurring and remediating that. And it's about the time and intensity and focus on those issues, right? We can't just, you know, have 2 30-minute sessions a week and expect things to get better. Those kids are going to need a lot more attention and time and focus, and we have to give it to them.
And this kind of goes along a little bit different twist. How old is too old to do assessment, teaching of phonemic awareness?
I don't know. I don't think there is an age that's too old. I mean, again, I think it really depends on the child, and it depends on the needs and the right assessments, because you might assume it's phonemic awareness, but it might not be. So you really have to make sure that your assessments are accurate and you're finding out where the breakdown's occurring. But if the breakdown is occurring at the phonemic awareness level, you've got to remediate that. That would be my advice as a reading specialist.
Okay, how does the Super Kids program different from Fontes and Pinnell's LLI program, and how is the text different?
Well, I'm not super familiar with Fountas and Pinnell LLI. I'm assuming, I know Fountas and Pinnell as like the leveled readers, like the ones that we kind of looked at in the presentation, where it's mostly pattern text and, you know, using a picture clue to kind of guess at the word. So if that's the kind of text you're talking about, the difference between that and the Super Kids text is Super Kids text doesn't have patterns. So you can't just memorize a pattern and make a guess at the last word based on the picture clues. I think you saw in a lot of the text I showed you, it's decodable, meaning whatever skills I've taught in the phonics or word work portion of the lesson are then reflected in the text that the kids read during sort of the guided reading portion of the lesson in Super Kids. So they have a chance not only to work on the vocabulary and the comprehension and the fluency, but they're also working on applying those decoding skills in the text that they're reading. And the reason why that's so different is because Fountas and Pinnell, I used to work at a school that taught Fountas and Pinnell, and we did the Wilson program, the Foundations program. So we had a systematic explicit phonics program, and we had a guided reading program, but the two were not aligned. And so here I am teaching all these phonics skills and then giving my kids leveled readers that have nothing to do with those phonics skills. They had no opportunity to practice. And instead we're practicing, potentially negative skills, right? That alternate neural pathway in the right hemisphere. So it didn't make any sense. The two were not aligned and not integrated. And kids were really confused about what skill to use. Should they decode, or should they use guessing strategies based on pictures and pattern text? It's kind of giving them mixed messages. So that's the main difference, I would say.
And then we had a question if the program goes beyond second grade and if it will work for a child entering fifth grade who is actually at the beginning of second grade in terms of reading level.
Sure. So the program, the Super Kids program, only goes K through 2. It really is focused on beginning reading, right? And so we're focusing on that learning to read stage. And then the assumption is that come third, fourth grade, kids move to the reading to learn stage. That being said, I don't see why there's any reason why it couldn't be used as an intervention program for an older child. It is a complete and comprehensive reading program, so it does take about 90 to 120 minutes a day to teach it. So depending on the amount of time that you have with a child for remediation, you might want to look at the Super Kids Foundational Skills Kit, which really just focuses on the word work portion and then includes some decodable text to practice and apply the skills.
And then we've had some questions about piloting and about program samples. So if you want to just use Elise's email here, she can forward those to us and get us any, we can get back to you about pilots or any information that you need on the program. And then that you sort of addressed this, but what are some of the best ways to build the language comprehension domain in the early years, kindergarten through second grade?
Well, we're building them constantly through read alouds. You know, read aloud is a wonderful tool for teaching the skills and modeling reading comprehension skills. Also, you know, content areas. So teaching science and social studies, not ignoring that in favor of, you know, just more skill work, right? So we still have to make sure we're focusing on building that background knowledge, building those oral language and vocabulary skills through building content knowledge and academic language. One thing that's really nice about the Super Kids program is it does include a very robust nonfiction element that has a lot of content in social studies, science, art. So I want to make sure, you know, we talked a lot about phonics today, but phonics is not the whole picture. Phonics is one element of an overall kind of reading system that includes building content knowledge, building academic language, building vocabulary. It doesn't necessarily have to be through reading comprehension until kids are fluent decoders, right? And you saw, even with the decodable text, that the kids are using in this program, they can still do some comprehension work, right? But we can do a lot more because kids' listening comprehension is much more advanced than their reading comprehension up until like middle school. So we can actually expose them to content and concepts and background knowledge and vocabulary that they can't yet access in their own reading through read alouds and the content areas.
Okay, and can you address the writing portion of the Super Kids program?
Sure, there's a robust writing program that's very much tied to and integrated with the rest of the Super Kids program. Writing instruction starts about 2 to 3 times a week at the beginning of kindergarten. By middle kindergarten, there's a writing lesson every single day, and that follows it all the way through the end of second. So daily writing from middle of kindergarten through the end of second grade. There's generally a short kind of mini lesson where the teacher is modeling and explaining the task. Then there's a period of time where the children are practicing and applying what they learn. And then there's a period of time for sharing. And it takes kids through the reading process, planning and drafting, and then editing and revising, and then publishing and sharing. And again, very much tied to the core instructions. The writing instruction is tied to the themes of the unit, tied to the word work. Whatever is taught in the word work portion is then, expected to be utilized and applied in the writing section as well.
And someone just asked to repeat the name of the foundational skills kit. It's just the Super Kids Foundational Skills Kit. And then what assessments outside of the program do you recommend?
Well, Dibbles is the classic, right? If you haven't heard of Dibbles, first of all, it's free. So that's really important. And it's really used as a screening measure. So the way that I've always used Dibbles is every child gets the benchmark assessments at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the year. And that will tell us who's at risk for reading difficulties. And then we take those kids and we do some intervention and we progress monitor them all along the way to make sure that they are continuing to make progress. Now, again, that's a screening measure. That's not a diagnostic tool. If a child is, some people are asking me, like, what if the children's in middle school and is reading at a first or second grade level? Well, likely that child has a pretty severe reading disability. And so I would certainly turn to your school's reading specialist or your special education teacher to do more diagnostic assessments that look at the point of breakdown, which might be phonemic or phonological awareness or written language or, reading comprehension or vocabulary. And they have diagnostic tests like that, like the CTOP and the Woodcock-Johnson. I can certainly write that in a longer, there's so many assessments out there, but.
Now I can chime in here too from Lexplore. What we do is a reading assessment that uses AI and eye tracking. And it's a diagnostic tool that allows you to see immediately within like 3 minutes. So when we're thinking about the COVID slide and we're thinking about the summer slide and how do we quickly assess where these kids are at and apply these strategies and the approach that Elise has been talking about this week. Obviously, we're hosting, so we're going to pitch our tool and say it's a great assessment. And, in 3 minutes, you can get a pulse of where your child's at or where your student's at in the classroom. So I'd be happy to follow up with anybody in regards to assessment as well. I know we're running out of time as we conclude this webinar. I'm so thankful for Elise and the Super Kids team and all of just the rich research. I know I learned something and I've been in this space a long time. So thank you so much. If those of you that want to stay on, I don't know if we have any more questions, Susan, but you're happy to, I think Elise is happy to stay on for a couple more minutes and answer any additional questions. And then we'll sort of wrap up. But so thankful for this webinar today. Can't wait to share it with our colleagues as well. Susan, do we have any other questions?
The only other question was, does Super Kids lend itself to SAI reading intervention? If so, is there a placement assessment based on skill level, not grade level?
I don't know enough about SAI to say. We do have benchmark assessments at the beginning of each year and then progress tests throughout in the Super Kids program, but they're based on what the kids have learned in the program or what they might need to learn in the program. So I'm not sure how much that aligns with SAI.
Okay, and here's a great question. With the COVID-19 and instruction moving online, what resources are available in Super Kids to support instruction virtually? And then someone else asked about the digital component. So those two kind of go together.
Yeah, well, I'm actually so glad that someone asked that question because it's very exciting, but we are currently filming grade level lessons, full and complete grade level lessons for K through 2 for the Super Kids program. That could sort of be utilized as core instruction potentially. In addition, we have a really wonderful teacher portal, so an online teacher portal. So as a teacher, you know, I could share my screen. I can show all the materials on my screen. Every single material in the program that's in print is also available online on the portal. There's also a parent portal, so parents can access a lot of the materials at home. Teachers can post assignments and homework that parents can then access on their parent portal, as well as fun games that go along with the word work, and also all the books. So all of the, except for the second grade book club novels, which are not our copyright, all of the other texts in the program are included on the portal as well. So kids can actually read them if they don't have the actual books in hand, because with COVID, I know with like my own kids, they were kind of sent home that day and didn't bring any of their books with them. So you can access all of the books online through that parent portal as well.
I have a question, because I'm sure a lot of the teachers that are on here, for some, this is just reinforcing what they already know about the science of reading, but for others, they're really curious about what are the first steps that I take? You know, I want to assess my kids quickly and get them on the right path. I want to apply the science of reading, you know, approach to how I'm going to teach my students. What are some of the first steps that they can take in the classroom and prepare this summer to really close that gap in the as quickly as possible?
Well, attending this webinar, I feel like is a really great first step. So congratulations, step 1 complete. I think that also, you know, there's been a lot of buzz about the science of reading lately. So my recommendation would be check out a few websites, check out the Reading League, check out Emily Hanford's work. So Emily Hanford is a journalist, an educational journalist, and she has been sort of researching this topic for a few years now and has written and done a few podcasts on the topic that are really amazing and eye-opening and enlightening, and I would highly recommend them. The Education Week did a series on the science of reading and what a science of reading classroom looks like, kind of talking about the difference between what guided reading and sort of like a 3 cueing system looks like versus, or balanced literacy versus science of reading, and how kind of the differences between those. So what might like a reading lesson look like? What might a word wall look like in the 2 different classrooms? I think that's really helpful. And then obviously I'm here talking about Super Kids, but a program that's like Super Kids, right? That has all of the elements you need makes it a lot easier. So with a program that's like Super Kids that's completely integrated and has all of the pieces I need, I'm not sort of reinventing the wheel. So if you have the ability, you know, to purchase a program that is, you know, comprehensive and utilizes, you know, is based on research, based on evidence, based on the science of reading, that is going to help you immensely as a teacher, so that you're not trying to create everything on, you're on Pinterest and teachers pay teachers trying to find materials that kind of all fit together. It's, you know, I always say like teachers are not curriculum writers. They're trying to teach, they're trying to differentiate their instruction, they're trying to help their students, and we're asking them to be curriculum developers a lot of the time. So it's kind of taking up a lot of their time that could be better spent on like actually teaching and differentiating.
And there's, Melissa, there's been several questions about your tool and how to get more information.
Yeah, so I would love to give you an online demo. I can do that really quickly. Just in a nutshell, Lexplore is a 3-minute reading assessment that uses eye tracking and AI. And so we can pinpoint immediately where a student's at in terms of fluency and comprehension, even silent reading fluency because of that eye tracking component. Our information is going to be up on the slide. I'm also going to be sending out an email to give you both Super Kids contact information as well as ours. And I know that if you need any samples of work or any other sort of demonstrations, that Super Kids is happy to do that. And at Lexplore, we'd love to do the same thing for you. And you can always invite your team members through a Zoom call so they can get exposure to our assessment tool as well. Susan, is this a good time to wrap up?
Are there one more question real quick? And there was a question about a homeschool. And Super Kids does have a homeschool package. So again, just follow up with us. And then someone recommended the science of reading, what I should have learned in college on Facebook as a fantastic group to join.
Oh, yeah. And also I want to point out that I think Melissa in the follow-up email is also going to be sending a link to a white paper that was written by Laura Stewart from the Reading League, all about the science of reading. So that's another wonderful thing to, if you're looking to take those first steps, to read that white paper, share it widely, share it with your colleagues. I think that's another great first step.
Okay. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much, Elise, once again, and the Super Kids team for being part of this webinar, actually doing the whole webinar. And yeah, you'll get all that information in the email. This webinar has been recorded, and that'll be available on our website. I will send out the link to all attendees. And please go on our social media page, like Lexplore, like Xander Blosser, and Super Kids. Follow us in the great work that we're both doing in this partnership for the science of reading. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Melissa. Thank you all.
Thanks.